Super. Okay. Welcome to our side event, Cool Solutions for the MENA Region National Cooling Action Plan. My name is Katja Dinges, Director at Guidehouse. I'm part of the CoolUp program and also work on the policy side. So globally, national cooling actions plans have already been adopted or are currently under preparation in about 40 countries. So national cooling action plan are an important tool, a guiding framework to assist countries in identifying pathways to integrate comprehensive action to reduce energy related emissions from cooling on the one side, aligned with plans related to emissions from refrigerant transition on the other side. They also offer an opportunity to the countries to consider how to improve access to cooling and therefore address additional sustainable development goals. National Cooling Action Plan usually comprise all cooling relevant sector, such as air conditioning, residential commercial refrigeration, industrial refrigeration, and mobile air conditioning, and contains market projections, emission projections, and arrive from that, develop policy intervention to counteract these increasing trends. They also identify financial and investment needed to be ready to be implemented. In most cases, national cooling action plans are also accompanied by a broad stakeholder engagement, which is also quite important for the later stage to be implemented with several stakeholders here in place. Therefore, national cooling action plans can contribute towards the targets of Paris Agreement as well as Kilgagi amendment under the Montreal Protocol. So in this session, we want to look at the national cooling plan development, especially in the MENA region, but we also want to learn from experiences from other countries beyond the MENA region. So the agenda will start with a presentation by Etienne of the key findings of completed NCAPs based on a report that was recently published. And then we will go into a panel discussion with our panelists here. And finally, I will take maybe the last 5 minutes also to open the floor for the audience if there are some questions. So first, I would like to introduce our panelists. First one will be Etienne Gonin. He is technical assistant in the UNDP Chemical and Waste Unit. Then Olatunji Yusuf. He is senior climate change specialist at the Islamic Development Bank, and he will share his experience on climate finance with us today. Then welcome Meral Mungan Ada. She is Climate Change and Environmental Portfolio Manager in UNDP's Turkey's regional office and also part of the CoolUp program. And she's also involved in the development of the NCAP in Turkey, which we launched in June this year. So happy to have you here. And then the last one, Chika Basin. She is Senior Advisor at UNIP, working for the Cool Coalition. She's also on the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and was also involved in the development of the Indian NCAP, which is one of the earliest ones, developed, I think, 5 years ago. So, then I give the floor to Etienne first to present the insights on the report summary of National Cooling Action Plan, where you evaluated 11 countries you supported in developing the NCAPs. Among them is Bangladesh, Chile, Trinidad, Tobago, just to mention a few of them. The floor is yours.
Hello to everyone. Thank you, Katja, for the introduction. Yes, I'm Etienne Gonin from UNDP. Very happy to be here for this event organized by CoolUp, UNDP and the Cool Coalition. It's a pleasure here to present the results of our initial work on national cooling action plans in 11 countries, as was presented. And you can see indeed the list of countries here. Basically, these are the first one that we did with the support of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, or Clean Cooling Collaborative, now that basically decided to launch this effort both at energy efficiency and refrigerant management in two national cooling plans just after the approval of the Kigali Amendment of the Montreal Protocol, focusing on the hydrofluorocarbon phase down, HFC phase down. So you will see that I will, basically the new publication is here, you can see it here, but we are paper-free event, as you know, so I cannot distribute it, of course, but you can find it on our website. And also you have here the little QR code if you want, and of course happy to discuss it further with you. And you have both the summary of each of these 11 national cooling action plans, the main features of them, and also some general analysis that I will talk a little bit about now. So as you can see, it's not only about the Arab states or MENA region, but we are looking at a little bit more globally and trying to draw some lessons overall. So I'll talk also a little bit about the methodology and also some remarks on specifically on energy efficiency. This presentation was made as well in the energy efficiency workshop that was held at the meeting of the parties of the Montreal Protocol a few weeks ago, already organized by the Ozone Secretariat. So thanks again to them also for facilitating this pavilion here. It's the first time that the Montreal Protocol has a pavilion at a climate COP. Here, well, just to give an idea, of course, of why we are focusing on this work at the conjunction of the Montreal Protocol and also the Paris Agreement on cooling, because of the importance, the impact, the global impact of cooling in terms of climate. Just a few figures here that, of course, always give an image of the importance of this issue. 2 billion AC units globally already at this point. Of course, that's an estimate. But also that if we continue as a business as usual, an estimate of 14 billion of both AC units, refrigeration equipment by 2050. So obviously, these are impressive growth trends that was mentioned by Katia in her introduction. And so we need to make sure that we minimize the impact on climate of this sector. So the nature and purpose of National Cooling Action Plan, that was already a bit presented. These are meant to be consultative process at the national level. They are developed and endorsed by the national government, so it's important to see that it's an effort led by the governments that will endorse it eventually as a national strategy and involving the various stakeholders that are important in this sector. They are trying to promote sustainable and smart cooling practices in countries, both from the energy demand, energy efficiency side, but also from the refrigerant management aspect. So it's like, coordinating and integrating these two dimensions. They identify pathways, the framework for implementation of national cooling plans, and also in some circumstances also looking at how this can be combined with renewables so that you really minimize basically the climate impact also from the energy production side. Some of the key features and messages of the cooling plans. So the ambition, it signals a government's ambition to pursue efficient, climate-friendly cooling through its policies and programs. It's particularly important, we're hearing, of course, of the cooling pledge that is being proposed by the UAE presidency, also the Cool Coalition here at this COP. The countries are committing to this, so one of the ways that they can achieve the commitments, the global commitments that will be taken at the cooling pledge is to engage on the path of a cooling plans as the countries have started doing. It's important that it's complementary to other efforts, other national plans, in particular the NDCs. Sometimes and very often that is what we aim for, that the solutions that are highlighted, the recommendation of the national cooling plans can be fed into the NDCs. It's flexible in the sense that the countries can decide pretty much of the scope at the start. You know, if, for example, you know, they feel that, okay, they cannot go too far in the first round of National Cooling Action Plan, you can focus on the key sectors without having a comprehensive, complete assessment, but at least the key sectors must be included. These core sectors that I mentioned here, the building, residential sector, supermarket, cold chains. For example, mobile air conditioning, in some of these NCAPs they were included, in others not yet. Important that there is this ownership, so it's nationally driven, reflecting the country's unique situation. And they develop roadmaps, so they propose roadmaps so to implement this recommendation, who should take the lead, which department within the government, with which partners to work, which policies to put in place, and also, of course, the financial dimension that Katja has highlighted, very important. So you can see that it's basically cross-cutting. Of course, here we are at the COP, climate COP, so is the Paris Agreement. As highlighted, it is can contribute, these NCAPs can contribute to the efforts towards the Paris Agreement, but also it links with the Montreal Protocol, you know, HCFC, phase-out management plan, or the Kigali implementation plans, as well as other national strategies, for example, on energy efficiency. Here it's a nice summary that was prepared by the Cool Coalition, actually on what are NCAPs, what tool it represents. So I will not go into details because it's a little bit of a repeat from what I presented in the first slide, but it summarizes it nicely on this graph. And you can see also, I think, the important thing at the top left that I wanted to highlight, it signals to the market, you know, what the government intends to do and what the stakeholders are engaging towards. So it's very important for the future investment in the country. Here you can see there's a methodology that was developed. So actually, the 11 national cooling action plans that we developed, most of them were done before this methodology was formalized, basically, or at a global level. It was used in the India, the ICAP, the India National Cooling Action Plan, the first one. So they used that methodology, and based on this global one was formalized by the Cool Coalition. So you can see the first stage. That is the moment where you establish the scope, basically, and looking which sectors you will be focusing on. Then you have the cooling demand assessment, sector by sector, and already making recommendations for each of these sectors of how to achieve sustainable cooling. And then you have basically the synthesis phase, where you actually put all the sectoral plans together to make it a national cooling plan, and also you look basically on how you will implement it. And I think this final step 7, is actually a very important one that has been a little bit underdeveloped, I would say, in the first NCAP. So we are trying to put emphasis on it. So basically, will there be, implementation committee after this that will help, follow up on the NCAP, also decide when it needs to be updated, and basically helping also with the financing of the recommendations. Some remark on the key section. So you have a section on the policy measures. You will find a lot of the usual suspects, I would say. For example, the minimum energy efficiency standards, the labels, for the cooling sectors, of course, but also linking to other larger strategies, building strategies, for example, the building codes, and also some dimensions like awareness raising. So a whole range of policy instruments that can be used by the country. An important part of the national cooling plans also are the market projections. It is a challenge to gather data. In all the countries, they face these challenges, particularly if you want to have bottom-up analysis, quite detailed analysis, I wouldn't say enterprise by enterprise, but, a good representation of these figures. So basically, you can decide also of the ambition of this data collection, also depending, for example, on the budget available to do the surveys. And basically, you can also combine with other efforts, for example, with Kigali implementation plans being developed at the moment with the funding from the multilateral fund. You can sort of combine efforts to have good surveys being done based on this cooperation between the various initiatives. And basically, it provides, in terms of data, a business as usual, often going up to 2050. And then you look at basically some strategies for emission reduction, looking at the costs, and basically how to achieve these reductions. And of course, there's an analysis of the investment potential. It has not been very developed yet in some of these NCAPs. Others are more developed, like for example, in the publication you will see that in Nigeria there were quite a lot of... in Nigeria you have... Oh, okay, sorry. In Nigeria, you had quite a lot of detailed analysis about these financial resources, but in other ones, it was just a first draft, let's be our first analysis that was done and needs to be further worked on. Here, I've just put a few examples of these trends that you can see across the various of these NCAPs, and that's just to give you an idea of this growth. You know, unabated growth if you don't have any action. Here you can see the HFC consumption in Chile, and of course it starts a little bit in the back because it had some data from 2012, but you can see it's just maybe 6,000 in terms of HFC tonnage in 2012, going to more than 45,000 in 2050. So you can see the type of growth that you have in terms of HFC consumption. You know, some of them are before the KEEP regulations were taken in place. So of course, there's other elements that are being in place here. But just to give you an idea of this growth path. Here you can see also the type of sectors that are included. Here for Lebanon, you can see here in Lebanon the unitary air conditioning is very high. Proportion compared to other ones, even compared to mobile air conditioning or commercial refrigeration. It varies obviously from one country to another, but that's the type of information that you can see in these NCAPs. Here you can see the type of growth of air conditioning, stationary air conditioning in Ghana. Also you can see the very high growth rate that you can see up to 2050 compared to 2010. And this is an example of the abatement scenarios that you can find. This is an example from Lebanon. So in the region, you can see on the left the basically the business as usual scenario. It's still plateauing after 2030, but to really manage to reduce the emissions, you need to take these measures, and you can see it on the right. And if you combine this with renewable energy promotion, you can actually go to basically a net zero scenario for the cooling sector in terms of emissions. Some country examples of measures, I will just pick a few. For example, in Chile, that's the Sustainable Construction Certification and Energy Efficiency labels that have been included as examples in these national cooling action plans. In Cuba, interestingly, in the National Cooling Plan, there is a plan to update the MEPs, so the minimum energy standards, every 2 years. That's quite interesting because we know that energy efficiency evolves very quickly in the country, so that's good that they sort of recommended it to have regularly. In Mexico, interesting labeling system that is described in the NCAP. It gives you the minimum requirement, and for this equipment, how much energy you'll be saving compared to the minimum requirement. So I think that's an interesting labeling system. And in Ghana, there's a little app that has been developed by the Energy Commission that is showing you in a shop, basically depending on the type of equipment, how much you will pay in terms of electricity during the upcoming year. So it's a very nice one as well. Here, just to give you an idea, in Trinidad and Tobago, some of the barriers to energy efficiency that have been listed, so I will not go in detail, but basically to give you an example of the type of analysis you will find, you know, what is limiting the work on energy efficiency in the institutions, the consumer behavior, and also in the manufacturing and retailing sector. And based on this, in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, this is how they have summarized their plan with their 4 priority actions that they will take at the national level. Here I wanted to mention in the case of Panama, energy efficiency was one of the 4 or 5 pillars that they highlighted for their national cooling action plan implementation. And within these pillars, they indicated the priorities, and I thought that was quite interesting to see. For example, the highest priority was on consumption preferences and changing the behaviors of the consumers. But also each of them are ranked basically, and you can see efficiency of equipment, so the traditional, you know, efficiency improvement of the equipment, priority medium, and district cooling, which for which we are working through a Jeff-funded project there in Trinidad, is put as low because of the initial large investment, but still included obviously in the plan. Another example of what you will find in the NCAP, here you can see, for example, I was just mentioning in Lebanon, basically the action plan and the key 4 points. And the first one was to say, well, we don't have maps and labeling in Lebanon. So this is actually one thing that they will be focusing on in terms of adoption and implementation. And you can see also as a second point, the importance of the testing labs, so that the country can know whether the equipment imported or manufactured is meeting in the future these standards that will be set up. A few of the lessons learned, I'm reaching the end, Katja. Here are the type of main barriers that have been highlighted, so a broad range still obviously, barriers to sustainable cooling. One of the points to highlight is that the innovative financing models are very important and not so much developed generally in sustainable cooling as, for example, they have been in the energy efficiency sector. So there's still more work to do to ensure that this cost, this important initial capital expenditure cost is mitigated basically, so that the banking sector in particular can provide the funding to the companies. So there needs to be more work on this, and here it would be a whole presentation, but I've listed some of the innovative financing models that you can look at in the publication. Basically you can see, for example, the energy servicing companies, ESCOs, can be a good way to approach this innovative financing, leasing models, on-wage models, on-bill models. If you're not familiar to them, you can have a look and see what is proposed in the publication. And that's basically getting to the end, just to mention again the opportunities for integration with other plans. So particularly with the nationally determined contribution and which national sector plan you can link to in the NDCs. That's important as well to coordinate with other efforts that are ongoing. There are HPMPs that are implementing their final stages. So HPMPs, HCFC phase-out management plan, funded by the multilateral fund. There's also some energy efficiency projects that are complementing these national plans. That's basically one of the sources of financing for the recommendations of the NCAPs. And this is also the case for the Kigali implementation plans that are just starting in each of the countries. As a conclusion, first step, their methodology available if countries are deciding to start the work on this, so they can use in particular the Cool Coalition methodology. That's very important. That will help also comparison across countries. There is actually a community of practice of institutions involved in national cooling action plans. It's actually a working group of the Cool Coalition. So if you are one of these institutions, please join. You can talk to Katja or me, or generally to Cool Coalition representatives, because they are, we are involved in this process. NCAPs are very important step for countries to basically help in the future further programming on sustainable cooling. And finally, just a final word in terms related to Sustainable Development Goal 17. Partnerships are very important. It's a good moment when countries develop this national cooling action plan to make sure that all the actors get an opportunity to cooperate together and take it to the next step. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Etienne, for this insight and lessons learned from the assessment and evaluation of the NCAP that UNDP supported in the past. It was a quite comprehensive overview on barriers, on challenges, and also highlight some important measures that should be in. You also said that these NCAPs also need to assess the investment potential, and that further work is needed to suitable financial mechanism. So that really brings me to my first panelist, Alan Tunchi. Just he mentioned also some innovative ones, such as ESCO models or revolving funds or so. So a question to you, what can lessons learned from previous green financing initiatives can be translated to sustainable cooling? We mentioned already the energy efficiency one, which is quite similar. More bits and pieces than large investments in renewable installations. So here I would like to hear, what can be learned from the experience in the past.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure being here, and thank you so much for inviting us to be here. I think this is a very important topic, and looking at even from the presentation that was just made, I think there are a whole lot of interesting things to actually learn from that. So I'm going to give the perspective of the bank. The bank actually finances projects in the tens of billions every year, and 30% of our investment would typically go into energy sector, which out of that, about 60% sometimes do go into energy efficiency in the countries where we work across MENA, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and some part of South America. So we do have quite a lot of investment that the bank has actually put a lot of money in. So I'm going to give examples of some of the projects that we've done, particularly in the case of Turkey and countries within MENA region and some part of Central Asia, where we've done a lot of energy efficiency investment, some of the lessons that we've been able to actually pick from there. Number one thing is the fact that one lesson that came strongly is around the place of awareness, that we understand strongly that awareness is very key, because this is not just a demand or a supply side, it's both ways. So there's a supply side where you want private sector players to be active in this area. And there's also the demand side of those that are actually going to purchase some of this solution, whether it's the AC units, whether it's the facilities or the solution that is being provided. So awareness on that side, awareness, albeit not just on the environmental benefit, because often we get carried away around the fact that, let's talk about the fact that this is good for the environment. That's not what sells in the market. What sells in the market is the economic benefit that comes from it, right? It's because in the end, it's business and it has to be seen as business. So as much as possible, when that core benefit is actually looked from the perspective of not just the environment side, but also looking at it from the returns that the investors are actually going to get from it, I think we do see that helps a lot. So creating that awareness on letting people know that, of course, we know that there are upfront costs, but then the long-term economic benefit of having those solutions, once they can be communicated, we do see, we saw that particularly in the case of Turkey, where we invested in, and Egypt as well, where we invested in quite a lot of energy efficiency investment. The second point, there are just 3 points. I'm going to make sure that I summarize them as much as possible. The second point is around the ensuring that the regulatory architecture and the financial architecture of any solution that is being brought, that they speak to each other. They're not, you cannot separate them. From the presentation, we made it clear, it was clear that this action plan, they are a signal to the market. So it's basically saying that you cannot just talk about the financing without talking about the regulatory framework. I give an example of a country where we were working on energy efficiency investment, but the government was still supporting subsidies in the alternatives. So we said, this is not going to work if you continue to actually support subsidy in the alternative that is based on fossil fuel. So you have to phase that out for us to be able to actually have adoption rate to actually go up in the new solution that we're actually proposing. So it's basically having them speak to each other. And that was one thing that we're able to learn in some of the countries where we've worked, where we provided financing, but then before we were able to pull our resources into it, we had to work with the government to look at how can you actually phase out subsidies. Subsidies are not bad. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying subsidies are always bad. Subsidies are bad when they contradict some of the other objectives that you as a government you actually have and you want to do. Subsidies are good when it comes to things around you want to actually advance sustainable cooling solutions. Now, you need subsidies because the upfront costs are quite high, right? Those are places where we need subsidies, but not in activities that would typically counteract that. So in that context, we saw that working with the government and helping to actually address that actually played a very key role in making it very successful. Underneath this, one other point that we were able to observe from the lessons that we learned is around the role of financial intermediaries. We are a multilateral development bank. Even though we provide a lot of financing, we do not really understand local markets. right? So we need financial intermediaries to be able, they understand the local context, they know what the market needs, they know the context far better than we do. So what we often do when it comes to solutions, like whether it's in energy efficiency, whether it's in renewables, is to use those financial intermediaries to provide those line of credit to them. Then they deal directly with the different customers and consumers that would eventually use these solutions. We saw that as an effective way that has helped to actually propel and actualize some of the goals. In terms of the role that MDBs play, of course, we provide a lot of financing. We talked about the place of upfront cost. That those are things that we've seen some of our clients, they've come to us to request support to be able to actually cover those initial costs that would typically be there. But for us, we see that our financing, while albeit they are good, you cannot continue to come to us and borrow every time for that. We want the market to be able to take this on. So we only play that role where we say, we're going to be here for a particular period, and there's an exit strategy to say, this is when we're going to leave. So we're going to help you to set up the whole system. And once we see that it gets to a maturity level that we can then exit, then we'll leave. So that strategy, we see that they have actually worked so well in the countries, particularly in Turkey, where we work with TKSB and banks that are typically helping to actually provide those line of credit to different private sector players. We don't deal with the private sector guys. The banks deal with them. We just support the banks. We ensure that the regulatory system from the government, when we engage them, they're right. And then the banks, we ensure that the standards that are required from our own hand, they're met. And then we just allow the market decide and play the game, basically. And that's how we've seen that work. And the last point here is around in-country coordination. Often, but we don't talk about the fact that coordination is so important because there are too many players doing different things. And sometimes you get to some markets. They can be very chaotic because there are just too many things. You don't even know who is doing what. You don't know what. And when that happens, it doesn't give confidence to anyone that wants to put resources into that economy. So those sort of in-country coordination at the level of the government, at the level of whether it's the Chamber of Commerce, the private sector players, I think is actually quite important. It's okay to have the strategy, but then that in-country coordination, we saw that play successfully well in most of the energy investment that we did in Egypt, in countries in Central Asia like Uzbekistan, and also in the case of Turkey. We saw them, they work quite well. So I'm going to stop there to thank you.
Thank you very much, Alontin. Also mentioned coordination, just the experience also from our Cool-Up program, just to talk to each other, different stakeholders with different perspective and understand each other. That's quite a big challenge, but super important to drive the transition forward. Thank you. Yeah, now to the country level. So Turkey is one of our countries in the Cool-Up program among Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt. So Cool-Up program is a 6-year running project under the International Climate Initiative funded by the German government. We have here, the aim is to upscaling sustainable cooling in these partner countries. And we work here on the policy side alongside with technology and finance. And one of the work we are doing in the policy work stream is a National Cooling Action Plan. So we are helping 3 of 4 of these countries in developing the National Cooling Action Plan. And Turkey is one of it. And has recently launched the NCAP process, also with a broad stakeholder engagement in June this year. So Meral, can you speak to the process of awareness raising around sustainable cooling among the political decision makers? And also can you provide us with an update on the ongoing process? Data collection, it's also a crucial point in the entire process. We heard from Etienne. And what Turkey hopes to achieve with this National Cooling Action Plan.
Thank you very much, dear Katya. First of all, I'm very happy to be here today talking about the other countries' NCAP processes and then what the Islamic Development Bank... Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I hope you heard me, that I was... Okay, I didn't know I needed to be handling it so close. Well, speaking of the country level, I should perhaps mention a bit about what CoolUp is actually doing. CoolUp is a consortium of different parties led by Guidehouse, and we are working with the UNDP headquarters office, and the Turkey country office is actually coordinating the activities in Turkey only. And here, what we are doing for the National Cooling Action Plan is that Turkey has already ratified the Kigali Amendment of the Montreal Protocol. And then the F-gas regulation was updated. It was amended accordingly with all the deadlines for certain fluorinated gases used in air conditioners and the cooling sector. And it has certain quota system. And Turkey has established a great software to identify the F-gases coming from different customs and trying to be having a good database there, which gas we are having in the country. I think here it is very important to mention that in the CoolUp program, we are not only working with the policy sector, but we are working with three pillars. We have the policy sector, we have the finance sector, and we have the cooling sector. And in this National Cooling Action Plan, we have identified that UNDP's role, Guidehouse and the CoolUp program's role here, is to bringing the relevant stakeholders, the government stakeholders together, because there are lots of vehicles with the, as you saw in Etienne's presentation, it's a considerable ratio among all the cooling sector. We have air conditioners and vehicles, which Turkey actually is currently collecting data for. So we are actually at a process for collecting data from a lot of institutions and private sector in terms of where sort of we have the cooling storages, where we have the individual air conditioners, where we have the vehicle air conditioners, or where we have the industrial chillers. So all these data are going from top to down and just bottom to up. We are collecting data. Now, we have mostly collected the data from the governmental institutions. When I say governmental institutions, it's not only the Ministry of Environment, it's also the Ministry of Transportation, Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. So it's just a diverse range of government sectors. And we have noted that actually they were not speaking to each other. Even though the process is very much interlinked with each other, we have had the stakeholder conference, and there we noticed that they did not have any sort of coordination mechanisms with themselves. They have to be having this coordination mechanisms, and I think NCAP is a great tool in order to be providing this coordination mechanism for FIRST, because at this place we had all these ministries coming together, talking about what NCAP is all about and which data we are in need of, which data Ministry of Environment doesn't have, but Minister of Transportation has. So it was a very important get together for us. And I think here CoolUp Project's role in terms of gathering the different, let me say, background stakeholders in the same topic is the key. So currently we're in the process of processing the data. Then we are going to be having the modeling, and then we are going to be writing the plan. I think the whole process is approximately 18 months process, but Turkey is very much interested and devoted to this plan. So hopefully in the next publication that Etienne will show, we will have Turkey as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Meral. Yeah, now looking beyond the MENA region to India. So as said, India published and adopted his National Cooling Action Plan 5 years ago. So the question is, how is the implementation of the recommended measures going so far, and what are the most lessons learned, and how can these inform the implementation phases of other countries that are currently working on NCAPs?
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. I think it was the last cabinet approval that the previous government made, actually, the Cooling Action Plan. So it was March of 2019, if I'm not mistaken. And And there was a lot of like movement around it, because the way that the India Cooling Action Plan was designed was, as the methods have suggested, one of the big lessons that has been taken away from the Cooling Action Plan that India launched, really the processes of as well, it was extremely multi-sectoral. It brought together not just different ministries, including agriculture and transport, but also housing and urban planning. So the Ministry of Finance, but it also opened up to stakeholders, which included industry, not just Indian companies themselves, but also international companies with a presence in India. It included industry associations, including the servicing sector stakeholders, and it opened up to all sorts of universities as well as think tanks. So, it was a really elaborate effort, and like you said, Miral, it takes about 18 months. I want to say that it was approximately 18 months. And the whole motivation behind that was that how do we now take this international commitment of the Montreal Protocol that we have and actually use it to make it work for India's development. That was sort of the ethos behind it. And so then if you look to the report which came out, you see that there is an emphasis on industrial growth. There is an emphasis on technology upgradation. There is an emphasis on what does this really mean for jobs? So there's a dedicated chapter on the service sector and how do you actually start formalizing the service sector? What should that training and certification scheme look like? And then, of course, there was a lot of chapters talking about the growth story, right? And India is nothing if not a growth story, especially in the cooling space. So it came out, there was a lot of ownership that was developed, not just within government, but I think in people who really formulate the cooling community in India, right? And we've actually got like one of our leading industry experts in the room here with us, so because it really sort of made us feel like, okay, this is our baby collectively. And so you saw a lot of movement start to happen, especially in the servicing sector where, because in our minds, the servicing sector is kind of the face of the sustainable cooling transition. You can come up with the best technologies, but unless you know how to operate and maintain them, or you have the people who know how to be able to do that, it's sort of a lost cause, and you can't really impact the demand side of it without having that readiness. And so we saw, MOUs getting developed between the Ministry of Environment's National Ozone Unit, which had developed, which led the Cooling Action Plan. And then the Electronic Sector Skill Council of India, you saw MOUs coming up, similarly with other organizations. The National Cold Chain Development Center really started to come up, and then the pandemic hit, right? And everything sort of went into shutdown, and of course, India was dealing with the challenges just as the rest of the world was. So it slowed everything down a little bit, but what was very interesting was the minute we came out of the pandemic, we actually started seeing announcements in the space of sustainable cooling from the Department of Industry and Trade. So there are now huge amounts of encouragement being given to companies to try and become a part of the global supply chain when it comes to sustainable cooling, and air conditioners in particular. And I think the big lesson here is that the conversation didn't really stop, right? So those of us who were involved, the government was of course very occupied with dealing with the pandemic, but there was a lot of attention being paid to how do we look at the cooling sector as a sunrise sector for India. How does it make sense for us economically to really talk about what this technology transition can do for the country in terms of jobs, in terms of growth, in terms of sustainability? And I think those kind of frameworks, so you can have a cooling action plan, but unless you don't keep updating the narrative and keep making it relevant depending on who it is that you're talking to, that ownership will fizzle out. So I think amongst everything, and you've gone through what the big lessons are, and a lot of these lessons come from what was experienced and piloted in India. So I think the really important thing that I want to add here is that, that you have to keep the narrative going in a way that makes sense for the relevant stakeholders, depending on who those stakeholders are. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I like that sunrise sector. That's really a good narrative, really also underline the co-benefits, or how you want to call it, of sustainable cooling and chances for this transition. Thank you. Let's keep at the country level. So I come back, Meral, to you. You already talked a little bit about this different stakeholder engagement, but how is Turkey already engaging with stakeholders to make sure that implementation can happen quickly and smoothly also afterwards? It shouldn't be just a paper. It really needs to be implemented. So how the engagement looks like to really ensure that?
Thank you very much. I should mention about the very strong NGO structure in cooling sector in Turkey while responding to this question. I'm not really so sure whether this same structure is followed in the other countries, I mean all other countries, but in Turkey we have like 6 umbrella NGOs where cooling sector is members with. And they're so close and so interested in our project that we are actually doing some of our trainings with these sector organizations, or we are having some articles in terms of awareness raising for cooling as an attachment to the other newspapers or magazines with these institutions. So they're closely following up what we are doing, and we can actually gather very, let me say, considerable amount of data from these organizations as well, because the very big players in the field of cooling sector who actually, let me say, export what the chillers or air conditioners to the foreign countries, and also small industries like SME level cooling sector industries are also members of these NGOs. So we are working with them in order to be reaching the same objectives of the Cool Up project. So when we have to be doing a training, we do it with them. When we do need to raise an awareness, we do it with them. So actually we are like, indulged in the sector through these NGOs in this field. So I can say that in the field of National Cooling Action Plan, yes, it is a very sort of a priority for the government in order to be reaching the Kigali amendments and the commitments. But at the same time, sector is waiting for this National Cooling Plan because they see that the whole environment, whole system is changing. With this Green Deal coming in, commitments are being made, and the Paris Agreement, Kigali, Montreal Protocol. So actually, National Cooling Action Plan is providing the cooling sector representatives a great tool in terms of increasing their competitiveness. So they would like to be in the game before it starts, and they would like to have a say in the system. They want to stay at the table and have their word shaping this National Cooling Action Plan. And I think this is a good perspective coming from the industry itself. I mean, we are not, as the project management part, trying to pull information from them, but actually they're pulling Cool Up project into this because they really would like to be a part of this NCAP process. And I think this is something that may be very key factor, key parameter in Turkey, that the sector is so strong and willing, let me say. Thank you.
Thank you, and push it, yeah. Then coming back to the finance world, and we already talked about the different perspective here. So what aspects do you see for policymakers and project initiators need to pay particular attention to in order to increase their chances of receiving financing? So just, reverse a little bit the perspective and give us some tips. What is important considering their perspectives?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is, has been a very interesting conversation. I think from us, as from the perspective of development banks, we know for sure that the bulk of the financing for the transition that we're talking about is not going to come from the public. It's going to come largely from the private sector, right? So whatever we do, the reason why we take the kind of risk we take as MDBs is not because we want to be, we love to take risk. We're taking those risks to be able to help crowd in private sector actors into those sectors that they would otherwise not want to go. We've seen sectors where private sector would typically not want to go there because it's so risky. Like you put your money there, it's gone. No private sector stakeholder would want to do that. But because we are public banks, we are owned by everyone, the government, the state, basically. So we do have some liberty to be able to take some kind of calculated, not just any kind of risk, calculated risk, but much more than the way you will find in the private sector. So with that understanding, the first thing that we typically always want to see is that the government is taking leadership in anything we do, because we are owned by the government. So as much as possible, we do not work in a way that contradicts what the government. So if the government is saying we're actually looking at advancing effort in sustainable cooling, it makes sense for us to align ourselves with that. So we do have our own strategy, which is basically what we call the country partnership strategy that determines where we work with a country within 3 to 5 years. So once we get that signal from the government, we engage them, and we know for sure that this is an area that they want to invest in. It makes a good case for us to be able to actually put a lot of our resources into that. The other area that we feel that we would want beyond just the signal and the regulatory aspect or the policy aspect is around the place of capacity. Capacity plays a very key role. Sometimes we earmark resources that are not used, most times. In fact, most times that happens. You see, when you talk about disbursement rate of MDBs, it can be very low. Not necessarily because they don't want to put out the money, but the capacity to actually consume the money, to use the money, it's not there, right? So that capacity to really be able to utilize these resources is actually very key. And that's why we really prefer to often, of course, we love to work in every country, but countries that do have systems that are very well established, they make it easier for our lives to be able to actually go in and say, okay, the systems are there, the banks are there, they're well established. Even the agencies that are implementing some of this investment, they have the needed capacity, whether it's the Ministry of Energy, whether it's environment, whether it's trade, whether it's agriculture. We know the capacity is there, right? So it makes our life much easier. It doesn't necessarily mean that if the capacity is not there, we're not going to go there. No, that's part of our role, to be able to enhance those capacity. But the better it is, the much easier for us to be able to actually get in there. One other point that beyond talking about whether people have talked about sustainability. For us as MDBs, sustainability is quite broad. It's not just about whether it's environmentally sustainable. It's about, can this investment, can it pay back itself? That's always very key. And the business guy would always do the same. Our private sector colleagues, they will tell you, if we invest in this, can it pay back itself? Yes, we know these are solutions that may not necessarily pay back themselves. And that's why we need people like us, institutions like us, to be able to play that role, to take that upfront cost. And then we have that timeline to say, okay, this is the period that we're working with you, and then we're going to exit. Basically, the point I made earlier. One point that I also would like to chip in, because I know we're running out of time, is around, there was a point that relates to monetary policy within countries, particularly with the context of inflation today, that exchange rate issues in many countries. Those are big issues, all right? Now, one of the things that we've seen in some countries where we've worked, where particularly issues around exchange rate can be a major issue. We know that from experience that there are solutions like this. When the bigger the scale, the prices will typically go down over time. So in the sense that if you have a huge adoption rate, there is an open market where there is a lot of players in it, then the prices will typically go down. But before you get to that stage, you need to actually provide some sort of incentive to be able to allow a lot of people to crowd in resources there. So it's all about the way the government is able to understand the sector and decide what's the best approach that works for them. So basically having tailored solution to the context of that country. But one last point that I'm going to make is around domestication of those solutions. Importing those solutions will not help any economy. I think that's something that is very crucial. If you're talking about cooling and it's going to be imported somewhere, it's not going to benefit that local economy. And as a result, those issues around exchange rate, inflation, they're going to always have a problem with them. And the adoption is going to be impacted by that. So it's all-inclusive solution where the country is also thinking about how do we domesticate those kind of solutions, where if we know that we have a huge opportunity to be able to scale this up, but then can we domesticate it where it creates jobs like our friend from India actually talked about, right? So those elements, I think they are so important for us as a development bank, beyond just the fact that we provide financing, but then the long-term transition and impact that that's going to make. I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Very much, and also tackling a little bit the challenges with regard to inflation and also the the high interest rate at the moment. No, that is really something that industry and also end users faces at the moment, and that needs to be considered also in the financing mechanism for sustainable cooling. Yeah, thank you very much. So then let's come to the last question, Chika. So the Global Cooling Pledge will be launched, I think, on Tuesday, so I remember. So globally, how do you see the role of NCAPs can contribute in achieving the Global Cooling Pledge targets? So what could be the role of national cooling action plans in this respect?
Thank you for bringing that up. So for those of you who don't know, the COP28 UAE presidency was very interested in developing a global cooling pledge to really bring a spotlight on cooling and mainstreaming sustainable cooling, and Cool Coalition has been a partner in enabling and facilitating that for the presidency. And my team has been working super hard, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that we see lots and lots of countries sign up on the 5th of December. And while I have not seen the final formal pledge, because of course the technical inputs went from us, and you know, after that the politics has taken over, so I actually don't know exactly what the language looks like right now, but I do want to share with everyone that on the back of the Global Cooling Pledge, we've also been working on a cooling spotlight report this entire year at the Cool Coalition with many partners who are actually here. And what we've identified is that you need action primarily across building codes and passive solutions. You really need action on efficiency and standards in labels, so maps and standards in labels. And you really need to look at your refrigerant phase down and what that could mean in terms of the pace and the scale of it, also like refrigerant management. And if you take care of these three things, globally we can achieve a 68% reduction in our cooling emissions by 2050. And this is going to be possible while you're increasing access to cooling. So it's not coming because inequity just sort of stays the way that it is, right? And for this to happen, what the report has also identified is that cooling action plans are one of those novel integrated regulatory framework pieces, you know, that can enable these three pillars and associated line ministries, but other line ministries as well, to actually be engaged in the conversation to a point of creating ownership towards implementation. So I think we're seeing, we've calculated, because we ran a survey as well for this report, where we went to all 193 member states of the UN, and we've seen that more than 80% of all governments are paying attention to sustainable cooling. There's at least one critical policy, which is amongst these three policies, that is in place in 80% of the governments today. However, only 53 countries are actioning regulation on all three. Right? And there are less than 40 national cooling action plans at play globally. So what we know is that the sensibility around cooling is increasing, it's becoming more mainstream, but the action isn't enough, the ambition isn't enough, and the implementation of these policies is definitely not enough. And our belief and our research finds that national cooling action plans are a very significant and important tool in getting that conversation and that political momentum going, so that industry, civil society, and international collaboration partners can actually back what the country is trying to do there.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, let's hope that as many countries as possible see that really that chance also in developing a national cooling plan, and therefore also contribute to cooling pledge targets. So yeah, let's see. So thank you very much. I would like to close our side event. I would like to thank you very much, my panelists. I think we cover very different aspects on developing and implementing a national cooling action plan. And yeah, if you are interested, you also can reach out to any of us also after our side event. And thank you very much for attending it.